Welcome, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar entitled Effective Participation and Engagement Towards Reparation at the ICC. My name is Benji, and I am a legal assistant at Redress, and we are delighted to have you all with us today. To begin, we have a few housekeeping notes. Simultaneous interpretation is available in French, Spanish, Arabic, and Ukrainian, and you can activate this feature at the bottom of your screen by selecting your preferred language. Please note that the participants will not be able to use the microphone function. However, you will find a Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to send your questions and comments there at any time during the session. If possible, please include your name and organization. We will also collect questions as they come in, group them as needed, and address them during the Q&A segment. This webinar is part of Redress's Solidarity Program, which aims to promote the exchange of experiences on strategic litigation, strengthen the global anti-torture movement, and contribute to a growing community of practice. It is also organized with the Victims' Rights Working Group. This webinar session is focusing on effective participation and engagement before the International Criminal Court and how these would contribute to shaping reparations. The primary objective of this webinar is to facilitate an exchange of knowledge and practice on how outreach, participation, and engagement across different stages of ICC proceedings can influence reparations processes and outcomes. The discussion will look in particular at how participation and engagement prior to the reparations phase can shape the design, scope, and implementation of reparations. It will also draw on practical experiences from the field, including approaches to strengthen victim-centered processes and ensure that reparations respond to victims' rights, priorities, and needs. We are very fortunate today to be joined by a distinguished panel of experts and one keynote speaker, bringing together a wide range of perspectives on victim participation, representation, and reparations in the context of international criminal justice. Our speakers include leading practitioners working directly on reparations, experts on victim participation before the court, and legal representatives with extensive experience on engaging with victims throughout the proceedings. We are also honored to have with us a speaker who was closely involved in the early development of the Rome Statute framework. Together, they bring both institutional and field-based experience, offering valuable insights into how victim engagement can shape more effective and responsive reparations. Together, we can. I'm being told that there is some echo on the sound. Perhaps we can address that. But I would like to just shortly begin by introducing our keynote speaker, Deborah Ruiz Verduzco, the Executive Director of the Trust Fund for Victims. Deborah will help set the scene for our discussion later with the panel by offering reflections from the perspective of the Trust Fund, particularly in how earlier stages of the proceedings can shape what becomes possible at the reparations phase. Everyone, please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Deborah Ruiz Verduzco. The floor is yours, Deborah.
Thank you very much, Benji. Thank you very much, Redress, and all our colleagues that are joined, those who participate in the Victims' Rights Working Group, and those who are committed to justice and to serving victims. It is an honor to be here, also joining the panelists that accompany me and that will follow in presenting their vast experience in sharing some reflections about victim participation and also the work that the ICC does in relation to reparations. Reparations, because of the impact they have not only on individuals, but also on the communities and in the long-term viability of the rule of law, on peace and security and development, mean for the ICC its relevance and its legitimacy. And we are very honored to have a focus in reflecting what has been that relevance, what has been that impact, and how we can further strengthen it. To share my reflections, I will be sharing a slide which should be appearing in your screen at the moment. Benji, you can see it? Yes, we can see.
Yes, we can see.
I don't think this is the right screen. Give me a moment. Perfect. Yes. Thank you. You're able to see the screen, right?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Very good. So the first element, of course, is to recall that reparations at the ICC are ordered by the judges on the basis of convictions. It is possible for the ICC to intervene outside of the convictions through the action of the trust fund, but these are not per se reparations, even if those activities also seek to redress harm caused by the crimes. Now, the liability for the reparations is with the convicted person, but the board of directors of the trust fund may decide to use the resources that it has collected from voluntary contributions to complement the liability. And to date, it has been the only way in which reparations have been funded. As of the end of last year, 8 individuals have been convicted by the ICC across 5 situations. There are 5 reparation orders already issued and 3 reparation proceedings underway for which we await reparation orders. Even if the number of convicted individuals seems small, we must remember that the smallest case before the ICC has involved 297 victims, whereas the largest to date has only, for one individual, an estimate of 49,772 victims. At the moment, with the reparation orders that have been issued, we estimate that there are more than 60,000 victims as individuals attached to the reparation cases, plus the affected communities who are often also recognized as beneficiaries of reparations. In all these cases, the judges have ordered the Trust for Victims to design the reparation programs and to implement them. We also must recall that these reparations are to redress the harm caused by crimes. Direct and indirect victims may receive these reparations. The type of harm that the ICC has recognized is physical, moral, economic, material, community, and transgenerational. And the measures that have been adopted are to address those harms. Some examples are cash as symbolic measures, educational support, financial support, medical services, psychological interventions and initiatives, reconstruction of buildings, symbolic measures, or any other initiatives to address stigma and reduce societal conflict that has been generated by the commission of the crimes. Now, the ICC is mandated, the judges are mandated by the Rome Statute to adopt principles that will guide the implementation of reparations. Those principles, some of them are listed in this slide. It speaks of the necessity that reparations be transformative. This is very important to the topic that we're discussing today about participation. But participation in itself is also an important principle where the judges have recognized the importance that victims participate in the design and decision-making and acknowledge and feel that ownership over the measures that are being implemented. Other principles are presented here. They include do no harm, conflict sensitivity, best interest of the child, gender inclusive and sensitive reparations, inclusivity on the basis of age and gender, and accessibility. As the jurisprudence of the ICC evolves, the judges are refining and expanding these principles that should guide the implementation. Now, of course, as mentioned, participation is a guiding principle. It is important, as the judges have recognized, because it's foundational to legitimacy, to effectiveness of the reparations, and to transformation. Participation serves in itself as recognition and dignity. It restores agency. It improves the quality and the relevance of justice outcomes. It strengthens accountability and the measures that have been taken in the criminal process. It also challenges impunity by allowing victims to be organized and visible in the face of perpetrators, and of course supports long-term social and political transformation. At the ICC, there are numerous phases in the process where victims can participate. These are marked here. Those that are in blue involve the criminal phase, and those that are in the transform color involves the aspect that is more concerned with reparations. It is important to highlight that participation can take many forms. Impunity Watch has done some research to systematize these forms of participation. Participation can be formal or informal, can be active or passive, can be individual or collective, direct or indirect. And we could also suggest that it could be institutional driven or it can be victim driven. Ideally, of course, participation is where institutions and victims associations meet and make possible that exchange. So throughout these phases in the process, we must analyze that there are formal processes of participation, mostly governed by Article 68 of the Rome Statute on participation of victims and the legal representation that is given to them, and my colleagues will speak about this in the next panel. But we can also see that there are other mechanisms through which formalized or more informal aspects of participation can take place. And I hope that in this intervention, we can share some of the mechanisms that exist beyond Article 68 for victim participation, and also to think together, how can that process be improved? So in the first phase, the question that Redress has is how the previous phases impact on reparations. And certainly, whatever the Office of the Prosecutor will do in relation to the scope of the charges and the quality of investigation will define ultimately who and for what are reparations going to be given. The judges play a central role as their decision will define the scope of participation, the charges that are confirmed or charged, and their understanding of victimhood to be able to have a reparation order. Now, for the trust fund, the role of the registry of the ICC is also essential. The quality of the outreach throughout the proceedings will ensure that the victims' communities are aware and understand what the proceedings have looked like throughout the previous years once we reach the reparation phase. Also, the scope of victim participation, how thorough, how efficient, how inclusive has been the victim participation conducted by VPRS will also impact on reparations, as well as, of course, the quality of victim representation through the legal representatives. Now, of course, there is also an impact in civil society, what has been the engagement throughout the case, in the trust fund itself being able to learn early about the case and the situation, as well as any other external activity that generates knowledge and a perception about the case in the situation countries, in the territories where the crimes have been committed. All that will be the context in which reparations are being undertaken. Now, there are numerous phases. In the reparation proceedings, the objectives are to inform the judges so that the reparation order will be in line with victims' harms, expectations, and context. The trust fund has numerous methods to ensure that we are able to transmit to the judges those victims' wishes. We listen to legal representatives, we hold direct consultations with victims, we conduct baseline studies that will mostly enable non-participating victims to have a say and to inform that reparation order. And of course, we also listen to the very invaluable contributions that are done by amicus curiae. There are important key constraints here, which is the time given by judges to make submissions in the reparation proceedings and the level of access that we can have to non-participating victims. After the reparation order is issued, the judges ask the trust fund to propose an implementation plan. And the objective is for this plan to be adequate, feasible, and accepted by victims. So our role is to turn this reparation order in something operational, to make sure that victims feel part of the design and feel that the proposal reflects their needs. We also need to ensure the initial phases of cooperation and stakeholder buy-in. We need to continue involving non-participating victims. And very importantly, we need to land it into reality, because whatever victims wish needs to be matched and put inside of the limits of the liability amount. That is what the judges have decided is the amount of money that the convicted person needs to contribute for reparations. We need to ensure also at this stage that there is an understanding of what reparations can be. Reparations are often groundbreaking. They have never been delivered in such context, and therefore understanding what reparations can be, what reparations are not, is also very important. And it is here central to guarantee particularly access to those groups that are often marginalized. In our methods, we listen to LRBs again, we conduct consultations, and we continue with the baseline studies to inform the design. Now, the key element comes with the reparations implementation. That means that we need to make sure that victims continue engaged and informed, that the delivery is prompt and is meaningful. And what the Trust Fund has implemented are participatory mechanisms in some of its programs to ensure that victims elect committees and that these committees are able to receive and convey information throughout the implementation, so that also the implementation can be monitored, and that also that information and adequate feedback is given throughout the implementation. The design of reparations is often a process as well, because even if judges have approved a draft an implementation plan, there are elements of the design that will continue being decided, and those decisions need to be undertaken together with victims. The participatory mechanisms in the Katanga, in the Almaty, and in the Onwen cases have allowed us or are seeking to allow the Trust Fund to maintain in that active participation throughout the implementation. A key constraint at this phase is that there is often uncertainty and very limited availability of resources. We are unable to deliver the reparations for everybody at the same time. And therefore, the prioritization, the decisions of who will receive reparations first and which measures will be delivered in which order is a central reason why participation is so important for the Trust Fund, so that those decisions can be made with information from the victims and that these decisions are accepted and are understood. And another important constraint is, of course, as well, the massivity of the victims that are involved and attached to a case. We will come back to those challenges in the closing. I am nearly completing. Now, an important phase in relation to reparations implementation is also the evaluation. That is that we have a common language about, did we achieve the goal that we are supposed to be achieving? The evaluation areas for the Trust Fund, or the questions that we seeking to answer in an affirmation, is to determine that the program was implemented in line with the reparation order issued by the judges. We also ensure that we have a victim-centered evaluation. That means, did the implementation of this reparation generated a sense of justice and recognition? Because that is the main purpose of the reparations. We also evaluate the qualities of the services or the activities. We also evaluate whether the resources, that's the time and the money, used efficiently, how were the reparation principles incorporated, and what is the long-term impact achieved in relation of peace and security, rule of law, and development. At the moment, we use victim-centered evaluation, and of course, victims are the key participants when we collect data. But an important thinking that we wish that we can undertake with the Victims' Rights Working Group is to answer what additional role can be given to victims during the evaluation, considering that they are also the recipients of these evaluations. So this is an open question for the audience. How can victims participate more actively in the evaluation processes? With respect to also a final phase, which is legacy and sustainability, reparations in themselves are valuable, and the justice process in themselves have enormous impact. but we need to maximize the legacy, the impact beyond time after the intervention of the ICC. We need to ensure that there is a long-term impact and that we also catalyze domestic efforts to ensure that more victims benefit and that we contribute to non-repetition. So the way we work is we try to accompany implementation initiatives with engagement with authorities to share lessons and to catalyze their efforts. And an important thinking here is what role can victim associations and civil society play to ensure legacy and sustainability once the reparations have been completed. Now, to move into the discussion, what are the key challenges in relation to participation during the reparations phase? There is a tension between process, which is what participation is, a process through which we inform, we take time to consult, we make sure that everybody is on board, and the tension with the need to produce results as soon as possible. So we need to balance these approaches. As I mentioned already, there is a massive scale victimization. There are also very often security concerns for victims, so participation can often not take place in a safe manner or is limited also in terms of visibility. It needs to take place in a discrete approach, which limits the impact or the perception of participation. There is also very various levels of organization of victims, often because violence creates in principle and as a main objective, that division within communities. There are also limited challenges that facilitate the self-organization of victims. There are very limited resources, as we have those mechanisms that the Trust Fund or the ICC can facilitate, but also victims need to be autonomous in the way they self-organize, and resources need to be available for that. And finally, there is also a key question. How do we measure success in relation to participation? If we have all of those different expectations of what we want and what is expected, we will often feel frustrated because we're not speaking the same language or we do not have a common understanding of what the objective is. So to hold institutions fairly against standards, we need to have that common standard. So what are we expecting to achieve from participation? Do victims want to shape the process, influence decisions and outcomes, or be represented? Then that is what we need to measure, to what extent we have achieved that. But we need to hear from victims as to what is it that they are expecting, and institutions need to be able to validate that this is something that can be guaranteed. So with this, I close this reflection asking for the very important audience to contribute to our thinking and to initiate this dialogue that at the Trust Fund we take very seriously in terms of how we can continuously improve the application of the reparation principles, in particular, the participative element. My colleague Odlegov will be joining later on the discussion. She's bringing extensive experience from the implementation of participatory mechanisms, and I hope that she will be able to also answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. That was very comprehensive. But before we let you go, we have just received a few questions from the audience. Some of them have wanted to ask anonymously and have sent us directly these questions. Our first question is, you had mentioned that out of the reparations programs, none have been funded by the assets of the convicted persons. And it's a two-part question. The first is, how does the fundraising happen for the reparations for that? And how can the civil society help the Trust Fund for Victims in raising these amounts that are needed for the reparations?
Excellent. Thank you so much. This is such an important question because ultimately to be able to enable participation, but also to deliver reparations, we need to have the resources available. And therefore, fundraising is the most important task that we do to serve victims. There are numerous sources of funding for the Trust Fund, and the main one in the design of the Rome Statute was that the convicted persons were to fund these reparations. At the moment, the court is very committed to ensure that financial investigations, freezing of assets, and other measures in relation to the assets of the persons under proceedings and also the persons already convicted can be enhanced. And civil society plays an important role in making visible the plight of victims and generating incentives for states to cooperate. The court can do investigations, but ultimately it's states who need to enforce the request for information, the request of freezing, the request of transferring of resources. So we are at the expense of the state's cooperation, and civil society can play a very important role in making visible what victims want, making visible what has happened to victims and what is the impact and why should the entire country be concerned about it, and to foster that political and legal and judicial cooperation that the court so needs. So that is very important in relation to the assets of the convicted persons. Also, information that can be provided directly to the office of the prosecutor to strengthen their financial investigations is very critical. In relation to fundraising, which is what the trust fund does, the majority of the funding is coming at the moment from states parties that are committed. In addition to funding the regular budget of the court, they give us contributions every year to finance the programs. And this includes that the board needs to divide the resources between the reparations and also the wish to deliver also programs for assistance. At the moment, we are in the need of fundraising more than 90 million euros. And the annual income of the trust fund, at least last year, was barely more than 2 million euros. So we are in a very critical moment where we need to ensure that there is, on the one hand, visibility about the trust fund, about the measures that are needed, but also a clear understanding on what is the benefit of doing this. And we are working through our evaluations and through our data to generate the stories and the evidence that proves that reparations not only benefit the individual victims, but benefit the entire communities. They reduce conflict, they increase the trust in the rule of law. And all that very important narrative is important that civil society continues spreading around. We are also welcoming private mobilization campaigns that any organization or entity may wish to undertake. We believe that there is enormous untapped potential in seeking contributions from banks, from corporations, from legal entities, and it is essential to start reaching out more to the public. So we need to be able to navigate between the justice environment and connecting those justice objectives to the bigger objectives and interests of the general public.
Thank you, Deborah. That's a huge task ahead of the TFV, and I hope that you get all the support you need, also with support from the civil society. A second question is from Sabrina Ochoa. Deborah, you mentioned that some forms of reparation may include initiatives for destigmatization of the victims to repair social conflict. What are some examples of such reparations that have been implemented, designed, or conceived?
Thank you very much. Indeed, the central element of victimization is not only the harm that it causes physically or economically or individuals, but victims become separated from the others. And it of course depends on the form of victimization or the type of harm. For example, in the cases of former child soldiers, and this is an important program we have been implementing in the Eastern DRC in relation to the Lubanga and the Taganda cases, where children were taken from their schools. They grew up to be combatants in these militias, and they have since been attempting to reintegrate. But there is fear around what they've done in the past. There is fear about their capabilities. There is an enormous gap between their communities, their own families, and those individuals. So there is a comprehensive approach to fighting that stigma that starts, of course, with psychological interventions, with dialogue with individuals, with the families, and with the communities. And we have designed, in this case, a very 3-year campaign through which we are socializing, and this is a local organization that with the community socializes the experience of these former child soldiers, their views. They try to humanize them, to reconnect them to who they were or they could have been. It talks about the phenomenon. It speaks about the illegality of it, and just simply generating dialogue around what has happened to them, and helping them to also through the psychological interventions, adopt an autonomous and productive life has helped to also reduce that tension that exists between former child soldiers and the communities to whom they wish to reintegrate. There are also different interventions, for example, when it comes to victims of sexual-based violence, who are themselves stigmatized and living in fear as what has happened to them is known. So interventions that allow the openness, being able to speak about sexual violence and understanding and overcoming social stigma around sexual violence is central. And these are interventions that are being designed also in the DRC, as well as in Uganda, for example, where sexual-based violence charges have been confirmed by the judges. Other stigma takes place, for example, in the cases of religious persecution, like in the Al Hassan case, where the Trust Fund has documented in our in our observations in the reparation proceedings, how the torture and the persecution of Muslim and other religious minorities by the Islamic jihadists and in particular by Mr. Al-Hassan, who was convicted for this, has generated these enormous social breakthrough and these completely different narratives about the experience of the minorities. So the interventions are often linked to psychological and psychosocial interventions that allow individuals and communities to be able to have a dialogue and face the violence that was experienced and bridging together and shaping together the future. They often include art, they often include sports, and they often, of course, include children, who are the ones that need to be also educated and brought into these peace education initiatives.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Deborah. I think that was a very comprehensive response. Maybe just one last request, Deborah, if there's like a 1-minute message you can give to everyone listening to us right now before we let you go and move to our panelists, what would it be?
Yes, I think we often think about reparations, about something about the past, where we're trying to redress the past. But we need to think about reparations and justice as building the future, as building the present, and serving as the Rome Statute preamble says that the ICC was established for the sake of future generations. So as we engage in justice initiatives, as we engage in reparations for victims, we need to remind the general public that, yes, it is about remembering the past, ensuring it's not repeated, but shaping a common future where everybody has a chance to participate, to be integrated, and where the rule of law is a norm. These interventions are extremely efficient. They are extremely, for the amount of money that victims are receiving, the impact socially is enormous. It's of enormous benefit of all us. In the challenges that we face globally, reparations are the symbol of solidarity, and this is what we need. Reparations are the symbol of community, and this is what we need as we face these global challenges. So the ambassador of Germany in the DRC, in a closing event for the first reparation program that was completed, reminded us that justice is an institutionalized form of love. And we believe that reparations, being part of justice, is that, and is that love and that healing that we give to each other as we build a society that is resilient and that faces violence and stops it. So we thank everybody for joining this cause.
Thank you, Deborah. I will remember that justice is an institutionalized form of love. That's such a very beautiful message to end with. Again, everyone, please join me in thanking our keynote speaker, Ms. Deborah Ruiz Verduzco, the Executive Director of the Trust Fund for Victims. Thank you so much. Now, on to our panelists. First, we have Judge Gilbert Biti of the Kosovo Specialist Chambers, who will share reflections from both in development ICC framework and in judicial practice on how participation was originally conceived to inform reparation and how this compares with how the system functions in practice today. Judge Gilbert Biti, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Benji, and I want also to thank Redress for this invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be with you today. Almost 28 years ago, on Wednesday, 17 June 1998, the third day in the first week of the Rome Conference, Fiona McKay from Redress, on behalf of the Victims' Rights Working Group, said the following in the plenary of the Rome Conference, and I quote, "Punishing criminals is not enough. There will be no justice without justice for victims. And in order to do justice for victims, the ICC must be empowered to address their rights and needs." With the ICC, the time had come to create a permanent international criminal court which would offer to the victims a better role than simply be a tool in the hands of the Office of the Prosecutor to move forward its cases, as had happened before the ICTY and the ICTR. The NGO's efforts in Rome were not in vain. The victims are no longer just witnesses used by the prosecutor. They may participate in the proceedings with their own lawyers. Article 68.3 is the general article on participation, together with two other articles, Article 15.3 and Article 19.3, giving them specific participatory rights, either at a particular stage of the proceedings, the opening of an investigation, Article 15.3, or regarding a particular matter, admissibility, under Article 19.3. Article 75 on reparations was also a major victory for victims' rights, as the ICC was given the unprecedented power for an international criminal court or tribunal to decide on awards for reparations for the benefit of victims. Yet, despite this unprecedented success on paper, more than 27 years after this major victory for victims in international criminal justice, NGOs are not fully happy, and rightly so, about the way the court is handling its mandate towards victims. What is happening? Has the ICC been empowered to address the victim rights and needs as requested by Redress at the beginning of the Rome Conference? Is it a problem of capacity or of willingness for the court to really address the victim rights and needs? What about the OTP, the judges? What have they done? Is there a real commitment of the ICC and its organs to victims behind the much often repeated beautiful statement that the court is victim-centered? Is it really victim-centered, or is it rather OTP-centered? Is the reality that the court, the ICC, is a criminal court where the entire court is revolving around the Office of the Prosecutor, waiting for what the Office of the Prosecutor is doing or not doing, and therefore totally dependent on what the OTP is doing? Was this issue already present during the discussion before Rome, in Rome, and after Rome, among negotiating states? Yes, it was. I remember perfectly. Some delegations, not all, but some vocal delegations, were very clearly saying the victims will be accepted to the extent they back the work done by the Office of the Prosecutor. We do not want victims to bother the Office of the Prosecutor. That was said, and that has been, unfortunately, I think, enforced to a certain extent by the OTP and the judges at the International Criminal Court. I think it is a bit sad, but that's the reality. Let us discuss about one crucial issue, the victims of the situation versus the victims of the case. We have to acknowledge that the victims of the situation have been largely abandoned by the court. And I want to see this through one aspect, which is a crucial aspect, I think, in the entire participation reparations for victims, which is the information provided to the victims about the ICC, about all proceedings before the ICC at all stages of the proceedings. There is in the Rome Statute an early information about the proceedings before the ICC, and that's the information under Article 15, paragraph 3 of the Rome Statute, which is the opening of an investigation. But this is only done when Article 15 is used. It is not done when there is a referral by a state party or by the UN Security Council. There was an attempt in the jurisprudence in order to have the court taking the initiative on informating the victims at a very early stage, even before the opening of the investigation. That was the decision taken in July 2018 in the situation in Palestine. But that was never followed after in other situations. Even if there is an information at the Article 15, paragraph 3 stage, because there is no state party or UN Security Council referral, that information is not really followed up. And then victims have to wait for a notification under Rule 92.3 at the time of the confirmation of the charges. This is both too narrow because it's only in relation to the case which has been chosen by the OTP, and it's too late because it happens at the time of the confirmation of charges, and that may be 2 or 3 years or maybe more after an investigation is open. Likewise, the right of victims of the situation to participate in the proceedings has been curtailed by the appeal chamber in its jurisprudence in 2008 and in 2009. After an initial decision on 17 January 2006 by Pretrial Chamber 1, which opened the possibility for victims of a situation to have access to the court, the appeal chamber suddenly stopped that. Why? It's always the same problem: to protect the choices of the prosecutor, to avoid victims of the entire situation underlining the limitations of the prosecutor's choices for prosecution. The victims of the situation are bothering the prosecutor, not reinforcing his or her position. They have to disappear from the proceedings. The appeal chamber simply wanted to protect the prosecutor and his or her choices. With regard to the reparations, only victims linked to the case can participate. Other options were possible. Even if the order was to be against, the order for reparation was to be against the convicted person, therefore linked to the crime chosen for prosecution by the prosecutor and for which a conviction was pronounced, the trial chamber could have even, in case of an acquittal, decided on the harm suffered by victims and developed principles for reparation even outside of the scope of the case. This was never done. The order for reparation can only be issued against the convicted person, but the trial chambers could have, for example, even when somebody was acquitted, issued principles, determined principles for victims. That was never done. Although in 2018, the appeal chamber restricted the participation, in 2008, the appeal chamber restricted the participation of victims in the case at the trial stage to the victims who had suffered harm as a result of the crimes contained in the decision on the confirmation of charges, it's a decision from 11 July 2008, it left a small door open. Rule 93 allowed the trial chamber to invite other victims outside of the case to present their views and concerns. That was paragraph 64 of that decision on 11 July 2008, footnote 60. This was never done. I will conclude by saying that there is a limited willingness at the ICC to really open the door to victims and to dissociate the mandate of the court towards victims from what the OTP is doing. And I think there is a need to push the jurisprudence in order to be able to open a little bit the doors for other victims than those strictly linked to the case. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Judge Gilbert. I know that we can all thank you so much, Judge Gilbert. I know that we can all we are all very thankful of the institutional memory that you bring to the discussion, and we hope that we can ask you more questions on that later at the moderated question and answer. But for now, I would like to introduce our next panelist. We have Soraya Brixi, head of the legal unit of the Victims' Participation and Reparation section of the International Criminal Court, who will speak from the perspective of the VPRS, reflecting on how victim participation is facilitated in practice, how victims engage with the process from the early stages, and which forms of participation appear to have the most meaningful impact on reparation outcomes. Over to you, Soraya.
Thank you very much, Benji. Good afternoon, everyone. So I will start by explaining a little bit what VPRS is doing, and then I will share some reflections on the issues raised by redress. So first, at the International Criminal Court, victims seeking justice must pass through two essential doors. The first is the door of participation, and this will bring to them the opportunity to be heard. And the second is the door of reparations, which will offer to victims the possibility of redress. But between these two doors lies a long and often difficult path. And the role of the Victims' Participation and Reparation section is to guide victims along that path, step by step, ensuring that no one is left aside. So what do we do in practice? First, VPRS plays a proactive role in reaching out to victims. We do not wait for victims to come to the court. We actively seek them out. And this is essential because many victims live in remote, insecure, or marginalized environments where access to justice mechanisms is extremely limited. Second, we help victims understand their rights. Participation before the ICC is a unique legal opportunity, but it can also be complex and intimidating. VPRS ensures that victims are informed, that they are supported, and they are empowered to engage meaningfully with the process. Third, we act as a bridge between victims and the judges. We transmit victims' applications to the chambers and ensure that their voices are heard within judicial proceedings. Importantly, when victims submit incomplete applications, we do not reject them. Instead, we assist victims in completing their files. And this reflects a fundamental principle that we apply on a daily basis, which is that access to justice should not be denied due to simple administrative or practical barriers. And our work doesn't stop there. We review all applications at every new stage of the proceedings. This is to ensure that victim participation evolves alongside the case and remains relevant throughout the judicial process. Another key aspect of our approach is trust. When assessing applications, we give due consideration to victims' accounts and statements. And this is for us particularly important in contexts where documentation may be scarce or impossible to obtain. In many situations, indeed, victims lack official identity documents, and in such cases, VPRS tries, whenever feasible, to engage actively with local authorities to facilitate that these documents are accessible to victims. When this is not feasible, we also seek the authorization from the judges to allow victims to submit other forms of identification, such as, for example, witness certificates. This flexibility is crucial to ensuring inclusion rather than exclusion. In short, VPRS does everything within its mandate to facilitate victims' exercise of their rights. And this is to participate in proceedings, to seek reparations, and also to be represented before the court. Now, let me respond and share my views regarding the two questions that Redress asked to me. The first one being, how do victims understand and navigate the distinction between participation and reparations, and what patterns have been observed? In practice, my experience, many victims do not initially perceive participation and reparations as two distinct legal processes within the International Criminal Court. From their perspective, these are part of a single, broader expectation, which is to be heard and receive justice. This often leads to a few observable patterns. First, that participation is frequently understood as a pathway to reparations. Victims, indeed, tend to see their engagement in proceedings as directly linked to the possibility of receiving compensation or other forms of redress. The legal distinction between the two is not always easy, is not always intuitive. Second, there can be confusion or misaligned expectations. Because participation occurs earlier in the process, some victims may expect immediate or guaranteed reparations. And managing these expectations while maintaining trust is a key challenge for us. Third, victims navigate both processes through trust-based support. They rely heavily on VPRS and on their legal representatives to guide them. And the system is complex. And without that support, many victims would struggle to engage effectively. Both documentation and procedural barriers affect both processes similarly. Difficulties in obtaining identity documents already mentioned and other documents to support the claims of victims impact not only participation, but also later access to reparations. And this reinforces the need for flexible and inclusive approaches from the outset. Overall, what we observe is that while the court operates with a clear legal distinction, victims experience participation and reparations as a continuous journey rather than separate stages. Let me now share some reflections regarding the second question that Redress asked me, which is, which forms of early participation have the most meaningful impact on later reparation processes and outcomes? Experience shows that early, well-supported participation is critical. It's critical in shaping effective reparations later on. And several forms of early engagement can be mentioned here. First, early registration and application support. When victims are identified early and assisted in submitting complete and accurate applications, it creates a strong foundation. These initial records often become essential for later reparation processes. Second, detailed and credible harm narratives. Encouraging victims to describe the harm they have suffered, whether physical, psychological, or material, helps establish a clearer understanding of the scope of the harm And this directly informs reparations design and implementation later on. Third, inclusive and flexible identification practices, allowing alternative forms of identification, such as what I mentioned earlier, witness certificates, ensures that more victims are included from the beginning, and this prevents exclusion at the reparation stage. Fourth, continuous engagement throughout proceedings. Victims who remain informed and engaged are better prepared to navigate the reparation phase. Participation is not a one-time event. It builds awareness, confidence, and expectations over time. And finally, the fifth is early involvement of legal representative. And this is a point on which I will explain a bit more what I think is very important. Once victims are represented, their lawyers play a very important, a crucial role in articulating victims' views and interests. And this can shape judicial decisions that later influence reparations at the reparations stage. Now, the lawyers of victims are not only gate openers, they are also drivers, and they can push the ICC to adopt a progressive jurisprudence regarding victim participation. In other words, they are also not only representing victims, they are strengthening the institution itself. And a last word, I think I'm still in the 7 minutes, hopefully, yes. Ultimately,
Last one, Sarai. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. The key lesson that I would like to share with you is that reparations are not something that begins after a conviction. They are shaped for the very first moment victims engage with the court. And ensuring meaningful participation early on is therefore not only about voices of victims, it is also about laying the groundwork for effective, inclusive, and responsive reparations. And I will stop there for the moment.
Thank you, Soraya. That is definitely a very clear message that how to answer the question of how early engagement would affect reparation outcomes later on. At this point, Grace, I invite my colleague Grace to share the Mentimeter in the chat or on the screen. We will now take a short 5-minute interactive activity so that we can learn from experiences from our audience. This is also a break for interpreters, so we will not be speaking during this time. Please open the Mentimeter link in the chat. Also, a QR has been shared. To answer the question you see on your screen, your responses will be anonymous and we will display the results once the time is up. Please provide one sentence or short responses. At the same time, you can also send in your questions in the chat as we will proceed with the moderated Q&A after our final panelist, Gilbert Andres, takes the floor. We start the 5 minutes now. Thank you so much. In one word, what makes victim participation meaningful in practice is our question. Yes, so needs-based, agency, impact. We see victim recognition. Okay, agency and impact are very common words that we see. Involvement. It has to be accessible. Thank you for those who participated. The next question, from your experience in one word, what is one way early victim engagement can influence reparations outcomes later on? Inclusivity, inclusive identification, trust, very important. Co-creation, active listening, awareness. Thank you for those who participated. We have another question. What is one barrier that most often prevents victim participation from translating into meaningful reparations? You'd like to know what you think? Stigma, funding shortages, lack of political will, lack of co-creation, lack of resources, a lot of things lacking then. It's a long process. Time related to the long process. Retribution. Okay. Retribution. Danger. And legal hurdles. We will be starting back in just 1 minute. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, send them in the chat, as we will be starting with our moderated question and answer after our final panelist. We already have a few questions that are in our question and answer box. You can send them anonymously. You could also send them with your name on it, but we will be collecting and grouping them. And now we're back. Our next and last panelist is a person very familiar to me. We will now be hearing from Gilbert Andres, the co-legal representative of victims in the Duterte case, and also from the Philippine Coalition for the International Criminal Court. Gilbert, who will bring a field-based perspective from ongoing proceedings, focusing on how legal representatives engage with victims at early stages, manage expectations around reparations, and work to preserve victims' interests for the future. Over to you, Gilbert.
Thank you very much, Benji, and thank you to Redress for having me. Also, greetings to our colleagues, both from the audience and from the panel. Now, the question really is, how can we have effective victim participation? What I'm going to share to you is my reflection on the experience that we had in a very specific context. It's from the Philippine situation. As you well know, the Philippine situation was opened as a preliminary examination last February 2018, and the scope of the investigation was from November 1, 2011 until March 16, 2019. And this is with respect to the war on drugs, that was implemented by then President Rodrigo Roa Duterte when he was president and when he was mayor of Davao City. Now, the experience that we had with respect to victim participation is from various perspectives. It's from our Article 15, Paragraph 3 experience. It's also from our Article 18 experience, as well as from the appeal on the Article 18, and also the Article 61 or the confirmation of charges hearing. And this has been borne out by my experience, both with my NGO, Center Law Philippines, Philippine Coalition for the ICC, as well as so many other CSOs here in the Philippines. Now, question, how can we have an effective victim participation? I do understand that Article 68, Paragraph 3 of the Rome Statute provides for victim participation. In fact, the ICC is the first international criminal tribunal to have victims participant in its proceedings. And it's often said that it's a victim-centered proceeding. But how can victims freely participate when in fact their immediate needs are very basic, such as food, such as education, such as security, and even freedom from fear? In the again, in the situation, we're from marginalized, poor communities. And in fact, most of the direct victims, those who were murdered, were actually the breadwinners of their families. Hence, during their murders, the families not only experienced the loss of a loved one, they also experienced extreme psychosocial and economic dislocation. So how can we have an effective participation by victims before the ICC? I'm going to give you a model, and this model is born out of our experience of all these proceedings from the ICC. It's both from experience as well as a vision and also a hope and an aspiration. And if I may ask Grace to please give the slide. This model is really what I call the diamond of support to victims. And if there's one thing that you should and hope to remember, it's this diamond of support. Next slide, please. If indeed this is a victim-centered proceeding before the ICC, then the victims are at the center of this diamond. But we know that the victims, there's really a distance between the victims. For the Philippine situation, there's The Hague, and the victims are actually scattered across the different islands of the Philippines. Hence, how can the victims actually relate to the ICC? So that's where the legal support, where the legal representative for victims come in. But at the same time, victims also need very immediate basic needs, such as food, such as clothing, such as education, security. And that's where the psychosocial support from CSOs come in. But at the same time, both the legal support CSOs and the psychosocial support CSOs, they also need support from meta-legal advocacy networks. They also need support from funders, and they also need technical support from other technical persons. Hence, this is where other support groups come in. And I will end with this note. Aside from the legal challenges of representing victims before the ICC, there's also the psychosocial and political context. For example, false news and disinformation against the victims. Hence, there's really a need for victims to have the strong support from all of the sectors. And hopefully, with this diamond of support, victims can indeed see that the ICC is a victim-centered proceeding, and the ICC also can have its legitimacy. Aside from the legality, it also has its legitimacy from its proceedings being victim-centered. And I will end here, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gilbert. Definitely, it's always very helpful to hear a perspective from the common legal representative of victims, especially because it's an ongoing case that has not has not reached reparations, maybe not yet, but we will see. At this point, I would like to invite our panelists, Soraya Brixi and Judge Gilbert Biti, to turn on their cameras. As we will start the moderated question and answer, we apologize on behalf of Odd from the Trust Fund for Victims, who is having difficulties joining us in the moderated question and answer because of internet connectivity issues, but we hope that she will be able to join soon. We have a few questions in relation to everyone's interventions. We have one question that is particularly directed to all panelists. The question is, do the court's budgetary constraints impede effective victim participation and reparation? And how do various court actors, the VPRS, the TFE, the legal representatives, seek to overcome this? I wonder if Judge Gilbert, you would want to go first?
But if you have, and I think Soraya could answer better than me, but if you have basically one person per situation, it's more difficult to do proper outreach, which is the key for victims to apply, because they need to know what's going on. And if you look at the reports from the NGOs, they are repeating year after year that many victims actually have no clue about what the ICC is doing. So the budgetary constraints are certainly a problem for victims' participation. Especially, there is also another problem, which is how do you pay the lawyers? And you have a lot of judges trying to have the OPCV instead of external lawyers, because external lawyers may have financial implications. So, of course, the budgetary constraints is always a problem to improve participation. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Gilbert. Soraya?
Yes. To add to what Gilbert has said, on a more positive note, the court is not only VPRS or the trust fund. We are, several entities, and we really try to identify synergies. We try to collaborate to ensure that even if there are budgetary constraints, we try to do the best we can with what we have. So through collaboration and coordination and division of tasks, we try to improve what we can offer, the service that we offer, to ensure that victim participation remains effective. We also are making a lot of efforts to try to improve the system, the IT systems that will help us also, not necessarily in our engagement with victims, but all the work that needs to be done behind the scenes is not only about identification and engagement with victims is also the work that we can do in HQ, in processing the files, assessing them, registering them. And this IT component is very important as well to ensure that we do our maximum with the budget that we have.
Thank you, Soraya. Gilbert, I don't know if you want to mention anything about that question.
Well, definitely, if there's limitations in the budget of the court, it also can affect. For example, for legal representative for victims, instead of sending two, there can only be one, for example. So that's where the limitation comes in. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilbert, Soraya, and Gilbert. Another question that we have received is on actually the point of Judge Gilbert on how the court might really be OTP or chamber-centric, given that the OTP's decision in relation to the scope of the case they will forward ultimately affects also the scope of those who can participate and eventually reach reparation. Gilbert, the question was particularly directed to you about what do you think can the common legal representative of the victims do about the scope of the case very early on in the proceedings?
Yes, this is very challenging because there's the interplay of the prosecutorial discretion, because we know the prosecutor is the one who defines the document containing the charges. And sometimes there's a limitation to the number of victims as well as the crimes that are being included. But I think there's really a need to advocate for the expansion of any document containing the charges in any situation. And I think it should also be the prosecutorial practice to include a colatilia in the document containing the charges, that whatever instances or situations or examples that are given in that DCC, it's only emblematic. It doesn't limit actually those victims who may want to participate. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilbert. And for Judge Gilbert, in relation to the very similar question about the jurisprudence of the chambers curtailing or limiting the participation of victims, one question was asked, do you think that in these conversations that we are having right now and with the CSOs, while different organs of the court are already being involved, the judges have not been very engaged? And the question asks if you think that it's proper to engage the ICC judges in these conversations, and if so, how?
Alors, yes, you have to involve them, and you have to explain to them what is the consequences, what are the consequences of their decision. And you have also to push through the legal representatives to have a change in jurisprudence. It was interesting to note, for example, then recently, with regard to the situation in Nigeria, where victims came and challenged the decision of the prosecutor, basically not to request the opening of an investigation. One of the three judges said, maybe the victims are right. And that's interesting. And you have now step by step some dissenting opinion by judges saying that maybe we could change a little bit the jurisprudence and be more open with respect to the rights of victims, especially the rights of victims at early stages of the proceedings. And I think the legal representatives of victims, the NGOs, they have to push for that. They have to invite judges, and they have to insist on the fact that the jurisprudence has to evolve.
Thank you, Judge Gilbert. One question. Sorry, Soraya, if you wanted to also share your thoughts.
Yes. This is an important point. You know, jurisprudence can evolve. And this is also the point that I was making. Who can make this jurisprudence evolve are the legal representative of victims. If we have lawyers which are engaged at the earlier stage, at the stage of the situation, they can maybe push for some changes that will make the system, the overall system, a more meaningful system, a system that will also consider in a better way victims of the situation whose harm will not be linked to any case. And you have already some lawyers, not necessarily victims' lawyers. I think, for example, of a defense lawyer in the Abderrahman case before the ICC, who suggested that we should divorce participation from reparations to ensure that reparations comes at the earliest moment at the pre-trial situation stage. So these there are initiatives, there are ideas that are brought to the judges, not necessarily heard, but I think if we have lawyers of victims who are engaged, who create proceedings through challenges, as Judge Beatty was saying, we can see a positive evolution. It's just a question of putting the effort in ensuring that this positive change arises.
Thank you, Soraya. And while I have you, Soraya, this next question is addressed to you. The question asks, how does the VPRS balance the need for impartiality and neutrality in relation to its engagement with the victims, which is necessarily at odds with the interests of the defense?
As I said in my presentation, we put at the core of our mandate the trust that we have with victims. It's also based on what the chambers ask us to do, to believe what victims are saying in their narratives. And so we are impartial in the way that we do our work, but we're also very open and very mindful and very respectful of the suffering of victims. And we will not challenge that victims are persons who have suffered harm, even if they are not necessarily linked to the scope of the case. So we will systematically, for example, I don't know, I know I should not be very long, but something very important for us is to also show respect and understanding and to victims of the situation who will not be within the scope of the case. This is why most of the time our field unit in the VPRS will organize numerous informative sessions to help victims who will not fall within the scope of the case to find other avenues for them to ensure that they are heard and they are supported, even if it's not by the ICC. So we of course respect the constraints of the judge's decisions, but we try to do that in the most kind way to ensure that all victims, as I was saying, we do not reject victims' narratives just because they are incomplete or because there are discrepancies. We always try to understand. We always try to give a second or third or fourth chance to clarify. And we put all the energy necessary to make things work for victims. We really go to them. We don't wait in our offices for things to happen. We really try to facilitate the victims' path, so they can succeed in their interaction with the court. We hope that we manage to do that in the proper way. But of course, we are always open to positive, to feedback.
Thank you so much, Soraya. Of course, we always root for the VPRS to be able to reach as much victims as they could. Before I ask Soraya, Gilbert, and Judge Gilbert your final closing statements, we would like to recognize that today we commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Anfal crimes in Kurdistan. We remember the lives lost, the families torn apart, and the communities that continue to carry the weight of this history. Despite the gravity of these crimes, many perpetrators have yet to be brought to justice, and victims are still waiting for meaningful apology, and reparation. In honor of those affected and in solidarity with the survivors and their families, I invite all of us to join me in a few moments of silence. Thank you so much for your participation. If we can have just one more minute to let Soraya, Gilbert, and Gilbert to deliver their closing statements. If there's any quick 1-minute message that or key takeaway that you could share, please do now. We can maybe start with you, Gilbert, as you came in last.
Thank you once again, Benji. And to redress, I think that the victims lean on the ICC to take them out of the darkness into the light of truth and justice. But at the same time, the ICC also leans on the victims so that the ICC will borne out its vision to stop impunity. And I think the diamond support is one way, is one model wherein victims can effectively participate before the ICC. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gilbert. Maybe Soraya?
Thank you, Benji. Okay, one last message on my side. If we want reparations to be meaningful, we must start by making participation effective. And if we want participation to be effective, we must design systems that are accessible, flexible, and grounded in the victims' realities. Because the credibility of the court and the justice depends not only on what it decides, but on who it reaches.
That was short and powerful, Soraya. Thank you so much. And Gilbert?
Thank you, Benji. The NGOs and the legal representative of victims will have to challenge the court vigorously so that it can eventually one day become really victim-centered. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gilbert. Again, thank you to our panelists, Gilbert Andres, Soraya Brixey, Judge Gilbert, and of course, again, thank you to our keynote speaker, Deborah. For such a rich and thought-provoking discussion. I speak for all of us when I say that your insights will undoubtedly support our work as practitioners seeking to promote victim participation and engagement, as well as reparation. Thank you again to our panelists and to everyone who joined us today. Please stay tuned for other redress and webinars coming from the Redress and the Victims' Rights Working Group. As a final poll, we have launched a poll that we will shortly appear in the chat, and we would appreciate it if you could spend a few seconds answering the question before you leave the webinar. Again, thank you so much.